So I've been asked to speak to you about some of my areas of endeavor. I am essentially engaged by AJC to be ambassador for Judaism to the religions of the world. Now, the religions of the world are not few. And one of the organizations I happen to be a co-president of is called the World Conference of Religions for Peace. This embraces 90 countries and 14 religions. Of all those 14 religions, Christianity in all its forms is only one. So here's some homework for you, or when you've got nothing better to do on your way back home from this evening's event. See if you can work out what those other 13 are. And I am mandated to relate and to be able to engage those religions of the world, which keeps me moving around the world probably as much as 50% of the time. My granddaughter says that when her mother talks of her Father in heaven, she's not talking of the Almighty. It's me in an aeroplane. But it is a great privilege to be able to do this work on behalf of the Jewish people, facilitated through the real pioneer organization in terms of interfaith relations. If you're interested, reference has already been made to the AJC website. If you can find interreligious relations on that website and you go into that section, you'll be able to find a timeline, an amazing timeline that shows AJC's positioning and its contribution at the most seminal and significant events in the course of interfaith relations during the last century. Engagement with communities and with traditions that were often at the time extremely hostile. And I'm going to refer to what is probably the most dramatic of these, because I can't keep you here the whole evening, tell you about every single interreligious relationship in every different geographical context. I therefore want to draw on two. On one which is really the greatest historical triumph that in a way is emblematic of the unique age in which we live today and the opportunities before us, one that has just been alluded to, and I will elaborate upon it, and the other what is arguably the most important contemporary challenge, where there are significant developments and achievements which we should be aware of, if for no other reason than to keep our spirits up and our vision alive and our hopes expectant. But arguably the most remarkable transformation in interreligious affairs of human history, that sounds rather indulgent in hyperbole, but I hopefully will be able to convince you, the most amazing transformation in human history is this relationship that we have just, the AJC leadership delegation, been able to celebrate just now in Rome. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it, even though you've already heard some of it. But in order to appreciate it, I need to take you back to the first years of the 20th century. In 1903, Theodor Herzl was trying to hawk his wares around the leaders of Europe to get their support for the idea that we know of as Zionism, the idea of the re-establishment of political Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. And in his diaries, Theodor Herzl records how he was given an audience with Pope Pius X. And he presented before the Pope his proposal, thinking that the Pope would see this as good for Christianity to be able to have the Jews established as the power in the Holy Land. Theodor Herzl didn't know too much about Judaism. Clearly, he knew even less about Christianity at that time. To his surprise, though he records it in his diaries, Pope Pius X said to him, "I cannot recognize you, for you have not recognized our Lord. I cannot prevent the Jews from returning to Palestine, but if they do, our priests will be there ready with holy water to baptize them all." Now, Pius X wasn't a particularly nasty piece of work. Most popes wouldn't have even given Theodor Herzl the time of day. He graciously accepted him. All he was doing in his comment was not trying to be insulting or in any way unpleasant. He was simply articulating what was normative Christian teaching, normative Catholic theology, which goes back to the Church Fathers, which said how to explain the destruction of the Jewish temple, the exile from their land, the Jews wandering, spurned and rejected and hated by all, if not that it was divine punishment for the failure of the Jews to recognize a true Christian revelation and dispensation, and that they would continue to wander. This, of course, posed a little bit of a problem, because if the Jews had been rejected by God, and according to this that we know, that we call today replacement theology, this supersessionism had been replaced by the church, then why did the Jews need to survive at all? It was Augustine of Hippo who came up with the idea, which almost sounds as if he learned in a traditional yeshiva, because it's a kind of a pilpul. And he says, the Jews, even though they've been rejected by God, remain in existence to prove the truth of Christianity, of what happens to you when you reject the truth, of how you continue to be rejected and ostracized and suffer, as they will do until the final advent, when the Jews will recognize the true claim and the true faith. And therefore Pius X was simply telling Theodor Herzl what was the normative theology. The Jews cannot come back and establish independent Jewish life until they have converted to the Christian faith. And if you think of that, and you think of today, where we have had now 3 popes who speak of the Jews as the dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant never broken and never to be broken, who have affirmed a unique bond with the Jewish people that is like a relationship with no other religion, who have condemned anti-Semitism as a sin against God and man. And as Pope Francis has recently said, it's not possible to be a Christian and be an anti-Semite. To a situation of where today the Catholic Church, I'm not saying there are no anti-Semites in the Catholic Church, but I can tell you one thing. That if somebody is openly anti-Semitic as a priest, he will not be promoted today to be a bishop. And that's not an insignificant achievement. The anti-Semitism is officially an anathema. And the Church affirms the undying, unbreakable covenant between God and the Jewish people, and affirms a unique intimacy with the Jewish people. And last week, a delegation of leadership of the American Jewish Committee of AJC, we met together with Pope Francis, actually the 5th time I've been with him since his election. I was at his inauguration. But we're received with warmth and affection by a pope who everybody knows is a great friend of the Jewish people. In fact, there's never ever been a pope who has had such an intimate relationship with the Jewish community. John Paul II, it's true, had his childhood experiences, his close child friendships. But by the time he was an adult, there was no living Jewish community in Poland of any substance to interact with. Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, now Pope Francis, not only had many friends with the Jewish community, and many of them rabbis. He wrote a book with a Jewish rabbi. He opened up his cathedral last year for Yom HaShoah Kristallnacht commemoration. He visited synagogues, had celebrated Jewish festivals together. There's never ever been a pope who knows a Jewish community, a living Jewish community, with the intimacy and the familiarity that he has. And therefore, he really feels that he's a friend of the Jewish community. And when you meet with him, you have the sense you're at a family reunion. It's a celebration. We're coming together with deep bonds of friendship. And everybody in the world knows, because this pope has had a remarkable impact since his election, a rather mystifying impact, but a remarkable one nonetheless. Everybody in the world knows that this pope is the friend of the Jews. What an amazing historical transformation. I mean, you can go through periods where there have been persecuted people who are no longer persecuted, hated people who are no longer hated, enslaved people who are liberated. All those changes, yes, have occurred in the course of history to many different nations, peoples, and groups. But has there ever been a community that has been presented on the one hand for almost 2,000 years as rejected by God, spurned and thrown out from its land to wander in perpetuity, in league with the devil, responsible for poisoning the wells, for the Black Death, for the Great Plague, for almost everything unimaginable, the most despicable of nations to have gone from that status to the dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant, never broken, never to be broken, of a unique relationship of brotherhood and of fraternity. There's nothing comparable in human history. If we can go from such a chronically bad, polluted relationship to one of such positive engagement and friendship, there is no relationship that cannot be transformed. The Catholic-Jewish relationship serves as emblematic of what is possible, and the truth is, everything is possible. There is no relationship that cannot be transformed. And that goes especially so for the area that I'm going to address, where some of you might be a little more skeptical, and it's not without its place to be skeptical, but which is the major challenge in interreligious relations of our times, and especially for the Jewish people, and that is a relationship with the Muslim world. I would say that it's the challenge of our times for the globe, because if Islam does not find its place within the modern world and feels alienated from our modern world, then violence and conflict are only going to increase, and ultimately, in terms of the capacities for destruction in our modern world, it's curtains for us all. We all have a fundamental strategic interest in a constructive relationship with the Muslim world and in helping the Muslim world find its place within the modern society, to find its welcome place within modern society. This is not always very simple. We, the Jewish people, and certainly the Christian world, have had the luxury of adapting to modernity and to the challenges of our modern world over the course of a couple of hundred years, if not more sometimes. For most of the Muslim world, they are suddenly being thrust into the fulcrum of modern society almost overnight, with incredible pressures and tensions that it doesn't have the luxury to be able to adjust to in the way that we were able to. And very often it feels extremely alienated within that modern world. Often that alienation means that you not only feel fearful and feel threatened, but you actually feel that you are assaulted. And you feel that it's your responsibility not only to protect yourself, but to protect yourself in what you see as a war. And then in that dangerous situation of alienation and hostility, you often can become a source of enormous destruction, of enormous peril, not only for your own community, but for the world at large. But the general problem of the adjustment within the Muslim world to the modern world, and of course I'm generalizing greatly because there's an enormously big Muslim world out there. You know there are more Muslims in India than there are in the whole of the Arab world. We tend to forget about that, let alone Indonesia, which has even more Muslims, beyond 200 million. So there's a very vast Muslim world out there. But a great deal of the hostility and of the complexity that is to be found within the Muslim world disproportionately, overwhelmingly focuses on the Israeli-Arab conflict. And the reasons for that are not too hard to be able to discern. Israel is at the fault line of the interaction between the Muslim world and the Western world. Jerusalem is the third holiest city to Islam. It is the only city that is not actually under Muslim control, and where there is a natural tinderbox, powder keg, that is associated with its status and with its position. But there's something a bit more profound than that. Within the Muslim world, there is a great sense of historical injury and humiliation. This is obviously in a contemporary context in relation to consumerism, globalization, secularism, but it's also related to historical memory and trauma of colonialism, of imperialism, of the Crusades, these things which for us are obviously such ancient history, nevertheless are often resuscitated within the Arab, especially within the Arab and Muslim world, because they relate to a sense of historical injury that is at loggerheads, at jar with their own religious understanding of who they are. Islam teaches that the faithful are God's select. Very similar from an ideology that will be familiar to many Jews within our own tradition. And if a Muslim believes that he or she is part of God's select, then it's very difficult to understand why so much, especially within the Arab world, is languishing while the Western world seems to be advancing. Very often it sees it as being at its own expense. It is even more difficult to understand why a little country that is, to a large degree, the major foreign entity, in other words, not part of Islam, that is within the Muslim world, is be able to produce a gross national product that is bigger than all the Arab nations around it. And that war after war, time and again, in attempts to be able to destroy it, it has succeeded in humiliating Arab armies and in being able to affirm its presence against unseeming odds. How to explain this? As a human race, we generally speaking do not like to look ourselves in a mirror unless we are the paragon of beauty. But generally speaking, to look ourselves really critically in the mirror is a difficult thing to do. And to look yourself in the mirror and really see yourself in terms of your own failures and your own responsibilities, that's a very difficult thing to do. And it's especially a difficult thing to do when you are part and parcel of a more corporate entity. And it's especially difficult to be able to see your own failures when you understand yourself precisely to be the choice, the select of God. How can one explain all these phenomena? The easiest way, and it's a human need, is to find a convenient scapegoat and is to say it's his fault. And if you believe that you are the godly and the goodly, then anybody whom you're going to see as your enemy, it's a natural thing to be able to describe that entity as godless and as evil. And the only way for many people within the Arab Muslim world to be able to understand Israel's success is to say, well, it's the work of the devil. And this is a diabolical force. And as a result, there is very often a demonization that exists that is widespread within the Arab Muslim world. Yet, having mentioned all that bad news and all the danger that it posits, we need to remind ourselves that Islam has never been as chronically anti-Jewish as the Christian world has been. There's never been anything like that kind of demonization that I described before, in which Jews are seen as in league with the devil, the poisoners of the well, the source of all destruction, etc. Some of these ideas have undergone some kind of translation into contemporary Islamic anti-Semitism in certain quarters. But nowhere is there an affirmation that Judaism itself is the work of the devil, that the children of Israel are rejected by God. On the contrary, while there are passages within the Quran which reflect tensions between the Muslim prophet Muhammad and the Jewish communities at his time, the reference to the children of Israel and the Jewish biblical people are overwhelmingly positive. And Judaism and Christianity are described as the religions of the book. And even though many you refer to the dhimma status in negative terminology, and within our world today, this status which within the Quran refers to the second-class protection of Jews and Christians, at its time was an amazingly advanced toleration towards the Christian and Jewish communities. It gave them a status, protected status, albeit not equal with the Muslims, but never one that took away their fundamental rights or dehumanized them as we had experienced in the Christian world. More than that, there are no two religions that are closer than Judaism and Islam, not only in the purity of their emphasis on the monotheistic concept, but in the similarities between halakha and sharia, the similarities between the 5 pillars of Islam and many fundamental tenets of Judaism. In fact, if you recall, one of the most important phrases on the Yamim Noraim, on the High Holy Days, which is that Tshuvat Filan Stakam Avirin et Roa Gezerah, that repentance related to fasting and prayer and charity, in other words, our concern for the poor, that these are what delivers us from the evil decree. We are affirming three of the major pillars of Islam in that. So the similarity religiously and a similarity in terms of our theological affirmations is overwhelming. And throughout most of history, it was generally far, far better for Jews to live in Muslim lands than it was in Christian lands. What this means is that there is enormous potential for us to be able to overcome those hostilities. Obviously, the greatest way to do so would be to resolve the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if that's possible. And therefore, it's of enormous potential for us globally to be able to see peace come to the Middle East, not just for the well-being of the State of Israel, but for the well-being of the Jewish people and perhaps for the well-being of the Western world at large. But even if that's not possible, there are still significant capacities to overcome that hostility and to combat that demonology and that misrepresentation of the Jewish people. One thing I discover as I travel in the Arab world, because I have a British passport as well as my Israeli passport, and that is if I try to be able to converse with my Muslim interlocutors on the right of Israel to flourish as a sovereign Jewish state on the basis of political arguments such as the Balfour Declaration or the United Nations partition or any area of international law or of political justice, I will get absolutely nowhere. But the moment I start to speak about the religious attachment of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, to what it means in terms of our spiritual way of life, as so central to our values and to our faith affirmations, I get a totally different reaction. And it is amazing in terms of my discovery, and there is within the audience one very prominent businessman who has had more experience in this in my regard, and I think can testify to the fact that where you encounter people within the Muslim world with genuine respect, and if you know a bit about their religion and their language, and you can show that, it is amazing how much one is able to overcome the barriers of suspicion and hostility. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need to protect ourselves against nasty elements and dangerous elements from any quarter. We need good armies, we need good intelligence, we need good security. But you cannot overcome extremism simply through reactive steps. If you want to overcome extremism and demonization and the perversion of religion, you have to be proactive and not simply reactive. And how are you proactive? You are proactive by reaching out, by showing goodwill, obviously with caution, and above all by seeking to strengthen the moderate voices, the balanced voices, the responsible voices that are there, but not always get the headlines. I was mentioning just before that I was in Indonesia on an occasion. I've been to Indonesia 3 times. On one occasion, I was hosted by the Habibie Center. Habibie had been the president of Indonesia after Suharto, on a conference on religion, war, and peace. And I was asked to speak about Judaism and peace. I gave a presentation which, in terms of content, I thought was quite pedestrian. I hope I didn't sound pedestrian. I hope I sounded passionate and excited. But the content was pretty basic. After I had presented, Habibie comes up to me and says, "Rabbi, this is so important. We never hear these voices. Where are the Jewish moderates? Why don't we hear them speaking out against extremism?" He says, "The rabbis I can tell you about are Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who says Arabs' heads should be dashed out on the rocks, and Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who says the little finger of a Jew is worth more than any Gentile. These were correct quotes, I'm embarrassed to say. Well, I don't know how many Israelis have even heard of Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, let alone Jews in the world, let alone beyond that. But what became clear to me that these were the voices that were being covered within the Indonesian press and media. Because by definition, there is a human desire for the negative sensationalists, and that's what the newspapers tend to cover. Not the positive and the constructive, and not the moderate voices, and not the voices condemning violence. But there is an enormous amount of goodwill within the Muslim world that we can tap in on, and a great deal of responsibility that can be enhanced. Again, I repeat, because I'm sure that there are those amongst you that are a little bit skeptical, I am not saying that there are not some serious challenges and dangers. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we need to put down our measures of protection and of analysis and of security and guaranteeing our ability to be able to live freely as we choose. But it's not enough to simply cry Gewalt. It's no solution to curse the darkness. We have to find ways to light the candles. And there are some very significant developments in that regard, and I just want to conclude this presentation by telling you about one of them. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, the very heartland of the Muslim world, has launched an interfaith initiative. He started this convening representatives of the Muslim world at large, Shia and Sunni, all together in Mecca, to get their support for the concept of dialogue, where he said there are challenges in our world today, social, scientific, environmental, and we have to consult together with the religions of the world for the betterment of humanity. To cut a long story short, I became involved in this particular enterprise, and a center was established in Vienna, together with the governments of Austria and Spain, for a permanent international location for interfaith and intercultural dialogue. This King Abdullah Center for Interreligious International Dialogue, this center has already taken some important initiatives, and one of them is in the field of education. An education to advance and promote interfaith understanding and dialogue. And first and foremost, this has to relate internally to Saudi Arabia, which has hardly been a paragon of tolerance, let alone of interfaith understanding or of dialogue in the past. This king is a significant man, and not a spring chicken by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, there's plenty of enlightened self-interest at stake here. He understands that if Saudi Arabia is not going to change, then he and the royal household could be left aside by history as things continue to march on. He understands that there is a need to be able to present Islam in the world in a more constructive light. There are probably also regional political issues at stake, in terms of who really leads the Muslim world and who is able to utilize soft power effectively. But at the meeting when he received us, and I think I'm probably the first Israeli rabbi to have been received by the King of Saudi Arabia, and to my surprise I was asked by my colleagues on the board to be the one who would speak on behalf of the group to the King said to us, the Torah, these are his exact words, in Arabic, but he had a translator, but I'll tell you something about that in a moment. He said, the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran all have the interests of humanity at stake. It is therefore our responsibility to all work together for the benefit of humanity at large. The translator reversed the order. He said the Quran, the Gospel, and the Torah, which I was able, of course, I knew at least enough Arabic to be able to see that that had taken place. But that's quite remarkable, and even if you say to me, well, this is a publicity relations stunt, and I think I've already given you enough information to suggest that it's more than that, but even if it was that, the very fact that somebody wants the public relations to be able to be presented as one engaging with dialogue with the religions of the world surely says something of significance. So, I repeat again, that if we can transform that Catholic-Jewish poisonous relationship that was vitiated by theology, we can certainly transform a relationship that is only poisoned by politics. It's not a simple task, but it's possible. And in this day and age, our efforts are compulsory. Thank you very much. Okay, so do you want me to say something about Ireland? I can't tell you too much about Ireland other than to tell you to be chief rabbi of the island is the most fun rabbinic job in the world. It's now, unfortunately, I left Ireland nearly 30 years ago, and now it's very, very small, so it's highly diminished, though it was never a large community even when Chief Rabbi Herzog left to become the first Chief Rabbi of Israel. You know, Ireland is the only country to have given Israel both a Chief Rabbi and a President. The United States hasn't yet done either, so we're waiting for that, hope. But it was a remarkable little Jewish community. When I was there were more Jews in the parliament than there were Protestants, even though there were 100 times as many Protestants as Jews. And there were Jewish Lord Mayors of all the major cities. And the status of the chief rabbi was enshrined in the Irish Constitution. In fact, I'll get back to that in a moment, but it was also enshrined by the taxation authorities. The chief rabbi of Ireland was considered one of the 3 archbishops in Ireland for taxation purposes. Where in the world can a Jewish boy be an archbishop and still be a rabbi? But in terms of protocol, the chief rabbi was 5th. So if there would have been an assassin around who in one go would have killed the president, the papal nuncio, the cardinal, and the archbishop, I'd have automatically been head of state. Fortunately, I was never tested. But it was a great fun job, and a job probably I would never dreamt of leaving if I didn't want to be together with my family while we were still young enough, totally integrated into Israeli life, and to go back to live in Israel. And I had no idea that things were going to work out as wonderfully for me as they have, and that I was going to be able to still live in Israel, have that privilege, and still be able to travel the world representing the Jewish people and feeling that one's making a contribution to making the world a better place. So, next one, please. So, the question was, are we able to take advantage of Pope Francis's amazing popularity in the world and his well-known friendship for the Jewish people in relation to the King Abdullah Interfaith Center? Well, I suppose the answer simply is yes, but we don't need to make any effort in that regard, because as I've already indicated to you, the Vatican is actually on the board of directors of the center, and in fact it's a founder of the center in a secondary status together with the governments of Spain and Austria, as well as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So there is a great deal of engagement in that. It's very interesting that the Vatican is engaged, because if anybody here feels skeptical about Saudi Arabian intents from a Jewish perspective, that's nothing in comparison to the justification for there to be skepticism from a Christian point of view. In fact, King Abdullah met with Pope Benedict XVI precisely in order to get his support for this initiative. And I'm told from a very good source that Benedict XVI in effect said to him, well, why should we come in on this initiative with you when our faithful can't even publicly worship in your country, let alone build churches? And apparently the king said to him, that's exactly why I want you to come in with us on this initiative. Because we can't change things in a revolutionary manner that will just lead to absolute chaos. We have to be able to change the perceptions and the mentality within our society. And if we are seen, I'm seen to show respect to you, and you show respect to me, and we're seen to work together with other religions on important issues that can contribute to humanity at large, I will make sure that this comes into our society, that it will appear in our media, that attitudes will be able to change so that we will be able to respond accordingly in due course. But this is a gradual process. And it's clear that the Christians have both, not only the Vatican, but the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Ecumenical Patriarch had decided that it's important to give them the benefit of the doubt in this regard. I mean, time will tell. And if I may mix my metaphors, this is not a Catholic marriage. We can get a divorce if we want to, and we can get out of it if we really feel that it's not proving itself. But it's a great opportunity, and clearly the Catholic Church sees itself as such. And I'm sure that Cardinal Turan, who is the person involved in this regard, has the overwhelming backing of Pope Francis. They're very close friends anyway. And Pope Francis passionately believes not only in a close relationship with Jewish people, but in promoting interfaith relations. In fact, at this very moment, a delegation from Argentina of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, with rabbis among the group from Argentina, a lot of them former friends of Pope Francis, has just finished a visit to Israel together and on their way to Rome, where Pope Francis will receive them. So this Pope is certainly going to be an enormous supporter of positive interfaith initiatives, and the fact that it takes place on the part of one who is known to be such a friend of the Jewish people will certainly be to our advantage as well. Why is the Jewish community faced with attitudes that it perceives as so hostile to Israel on the part of certain Protestant denominations, right? Okay. Now, first of all, it's very important to be able to make certain distinctions here. It's not all Protestant denominations. It tends to be specifically certain mainline Protestant denominations. And the attitude that is hostile towards Israel is not coming from the whole of those denominations, not from the whole church membership. It's coming from certain groups within it. Now, what are the motivations of those groups within it, which is another way then of advancing your question to its next stage? Those groups that are advocating for things like boycott and divestment and sanctions against Israel, generally known by its three letters, BDS, are made up of people, many of whom are very good, decent human beings, who genuinely care for those whom they see as suffering and downtrodden and those whom they see as victims. And when you watch the TV and reportage on what's happening in terms of the Middle East conflict, or even if you were to travel to the West Bank and to towns like Bethlehem and Hebron, and you were to meet them with the Palestinian Christian communities, as well as what you see in terms of the condition of Palestinians in the conflict, it's perfectly natural for people with a good heart to feel for the condition of the Palestinians. The problem is that very often those people with good hearts do not have either any historical perspective or any contemporary political perspective to be able to understand the different sides to the conflict. And this means that we've got to work harder to make sure that it's better understood in its complexity. And sometimes it's a little more problematic than that. The Protestant communities in the Holy Land, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, are tiny. They are all in all only a few thousand. Of course, Christianity itself is small, but the vast majority of Christians living in Israel, that's about the vast majority of Arab Christians, because there are plenty of other kinds of Christians, which I can clarify if you're interested. But of the 120,000, 130,000 Israeli Christian citizens, and in fact, if now I should speak of the whole area between the Jordan River and the West Bank. So in Israel and in the areas of the Palestinian Authority, of the maximum 200,000 Christians in that area, they are almost equally divided between Orthodox and Catholic. There are a few more Orthodox than Catholic. So the Protestants are tiny, a few thousand, a minority within a minority within a minority. A minority within the Christian world, a minority within the Muslims, a minority amongst the Jews in this context. And therefore, there is enormous pressure on them in terms of their own survival and their future. The mentality of a minority which we as Jews historically know so well. And therefore, if you live amongst a Muslim majority struggling for its own national identity and destiny, you are under pressure to show that you are as loyal to the cause as anyone, especially as often militancy increases within the Muslim majority. You are an easy target because you're often the only other, and therefore you need to show that you are not only as loyal, but you can actually be more useful. How can you be more useful? By enlisting your co-religionists abroad on behalf of the cause. And therefore, certain elements and certain specific individuals have made it their business to go to these conferences around the world and especially in the United States and to present a situation which is not totally false, what they're presenting, but is totally unbalanced, And they whip up the sentiments within these gatherings, and people feel very passionately about it. And therefore, it's not so. There certainly are some elements within it who are suffering from classical anti-Judaism. I'm not sure it's classical anti-Semitism, but it's certainly classical anti-Judaism. What do I mean by that? The idea that I referred to in terms of Pius X in his response to Theodor Herzl, that the idea that Jews as a religion and as a nation should not be conflated, the problem with the whole idea, therefore, of Jewish sovereignty, political correct ideology that sees Israel as an agent of the United States, which is the big bully and the big power, and therefore not always convenient to be able to criticize the United States directly, and therefore more convenient to be able to criticize Israel as a surrogate of the United States. All these strange concoction of both anti-Judaic sentiments, anti-American elements, political correctness, often get conflated together with genuine sympathy and humanity. So it's not a simple issue, but it's a very small issue. It's a very tiny element within small denominations. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't take it seriously. On the contrary, I'm saying that if we care about it, we've got to work harder to explain the complexity and the issues, and we need to be there on the ground with these elements. But we shouldn't lose too much sleep over it. The vast majority within the Christian world, and especially in the United States, where, of course, the Catholic Church is the overwhelming majority, at least the largest single denomination, and certainly within the evangelical world, though that's problematic in other respects, there is overwhelming support and understanding for Israel's needs. And as I travel the world, I am always amazed at how much goodwill and friendship there is in the world towards us. Of course, I get about 50 emails a day, and there's always some email, maybe 4 or 5, that are telling me about all the anti-Semitism. And it's not as if it's not true. It is true. There is anti-Semitism in the world. But it's not as if there wasn't yesterday. And it's not as if there wasn't much more yesterday. And there's never been as much goodwill today, and I hardly get many emails telling me how much goodwill, but I can tell you that it's there. And we are extremely fortunate and blessed to live in this age where there is much friendship and as much goodwill as there is towards the Jewish people. Where was the next one coming from? In Europe, there are 2 major problems that impact in terms of the Israeli-Arab conflict, and they're connected. The one problem is very large, dissatisfied and alienated Muslim immigrant populations in those societies. And when you do not feel respected or accepted within that society, you get angry. And therefore you look for ways to express your anger. And if images are coming into your living room of your brothers in faith suffering in a situation of conflict, it is a very easy vehicle to be able to use that to let off your steam and your frustration. And therefore, as I said before in my presentation, the Israeli-Arab conflict serves as a kind of both a lightning conductor and, if you like, a valve for letting off steam for that particular frustration. It's disproportionately focused there. So those attitudes will have an effect upon public perceptions, and they can have effect in 2 different ways. One way is to increase hostility towards those immigrant communities. And in actual fact, can backfire in terms of precisely the sentiments that those communities want to generate. I think that happens probably more often than not in Europe. But the other is that because these are often large populations, especially in France and Belgium, politicians have to take into account the frustration and the areas of concern of those particular communities. And when in surveys you see attitudes in Europe that relate very negatively towards Israel, in my opinion, what they are saying in the main is that this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is having too much effect on their back door, and therefore is making things uncomfortable for them. And therefore, their attitudes that are negative to Israel are very often a reflection of the degree of insecurity that is prevalent within those societies in terms of the way they are or they are not handling their immigrant minorities. And in the end, the situation of those immigrant minorities are the wages of sin of European colonialism that has come back to haunt them. So I think that it's possible to analyze it, to understand it, without needing to come to the erroneous and simplistic generalization that the British or the French or the Belgian are anti-Semitic. They are all human beings. They're basically human beings for better or for worse. And in the end, attitudes are influenced by the way they impact or do not impact directly on their lives. Yes, please. So the question is, to what degree does the amazing transformation in terms of Catholic attitudes depend upon the individual who is at the top of the pyramid, namely the Pope, or to what degree is it part of the actual structure? And that was why it was important for me to emphasize that wherever there is a priest, if they are articulating anti-Semitic positions, they are not going to be promoted within the structure of the church. And where it's important for me also, let me now clarify it, that the position, that attitude, the statement that anti-Semitism is a sin against God and man is part now of normative church teaching. And that the surveys that have been done, especially in the United States of America, which is the most remarkable example in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations, because you have the sociological conditions to internalize a transformation of two minorities. Obviously, one is much bigger than the other, but two very vibrant minorities alongside one another, but minorities within a general society to which they are totally committed, of which they feel a total part. That creates the remarkable sociological conditions that facilitates the internalization of the doctrine. And here in the United States, the educational materials that have been reviewed in Catholic parochial schools, first was done by the late Sister Rose Thiering, and then by Dr. Phil Cunningham, show that Catholic educational materials on Jews, Judaism, Israel are so good, quite a few Jewish Sunday schools could do with having some of those materials in their place. So the problem is not that there is a danger of the theology changing, nor do I think it's such a big danger if you have a pope who doesn't care so much about the Jewish issue. But I can assure you there will never be a pope who will be negative on the issue of the relationship with the Jews. The real challenge for us is how to be able to get those achievements translated into the grassroots in places where there are not vibrant Jewish communities, and places where Jews do not feature on the radar screen at all. Certain parts of Africa, certain parts of Southeast Asia, and certain parts of Latin America. That's why, while on principle the answer to your question is, you don't need to worry, we don't need to worry, this is established transformation in the fabric of the church. We do still have a lot to do in terms of the educational task, and that's why this is a golden moment with Pope Francis, an Argentinian Latin American Pope, at the helm, and an opportunity now to do more to get these transformations into parochial schools and into the courses and programs for formation of priests, especially in Latin America. So the fact that the revolution has taken place doesn't mean that everything is totally hunky-dory. There's still more work to be done. There's still more effort that needs to be put in, and we mustn't rest on our laurels. But I am sure that we can be absolutely confident that there is never again going to be any kind of anti-Semitic or anti-Judaic doctrine within the Catholic Church, and its attitude will now be for eternity, for as long as that may be, only positive towards the Jewish people. So I've been asked to define the term evangelical, and how do I suggest that one should respond to those evangelicals who support Israel because they believe it is a step to bringing about the second coming and the final triumph of Christianity in the world at large. So it's a very important question, a very important point that we need to give attention to, that the term evangelical is, like many terms and many denominational usages, often used in a very generalized and unfair manner. Simply to bear in mind, so that we don't automatically identify evangelical either with political, let alone religious conservatism, we should bear in mind that both Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton are evangelicals. So there's a big spectrum, and in Washington there is actually quite a left-wing organization by the name of Sojourners, which is an evangelical organization in terms of its political positions and advocacy. And there is a big spectrum. But we do tend to use the word evangelical to refer to those who could be identified by two and possibly three, especially with regards to the other part of your question, clear criteria. One of these criteria is a belief in a strong conviction that the Bible is the literal word of God. Now, there are some more elements within the evangelical world who would still call themselves evangelical, who would look perhaps critically at the text, but they are relatively small. The vast majority of evangelicals are united in their belief that Scripture is the ipsissima verba, it's the literal word of God, and therefore, if you could find a contradiction, the problem is you, not the text. The other criterion is, and it's really going back to classical Protestantism in both regards. In a sense, it's like Nature Charta remained loyal to the original Agudat Yisrael position, if you know what I'm referring to, while the rest of the Haredi world changed because of the reality of Israel. And this evangelical ideology has been truer to or remain more loyal to original Protestant thinking, both with regards to the biblical text and to the belief that salvation is a gift from God, and that in order for the state of your soul to be redeemed from hell and condemnation, and that in order, therefore, to experience this and to receive God's grace and redemption, you have to have a personal experience, very often used in terms of language, to be born again. And that is essentially the powerful personal experience that very often creates a very significant strain of individualism within that particular community, despite its conservatism. The third element, which is not true for all evangelicals, but certainly true for the most passionate supporters of Israel, is the belief that we are living at a critical historical moment, even the end of times. And related to that, in many quarters, that because the Bible is the literal word of God, and because we are living at the end of times, that you can actually read the roadmap of the final redemption in the biblical text. Now, all these things mean that there is a very special relationship in those communities, both to the text of the Jewish people, the Hebrew Bible, and to the people of that text, the children of Israel. And therefore, very often, a sense of familiarity in that regard. Together with that comes a theological problem, because if we do not have that experience which is central to them, then Jews are generally seen as condemned, and therefore not able to get their ticket through the pearly gates into heaven. If you therefore also believe that we are at this particular juncture at time in the historic final advent, and you read the Bible literally, then you certainly come to the conclusion that the ingathering of the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland is a critical component of the final Messianic Advent. And final Messianic Advent is often portrayed as a great showdown between the great adversaries of the godly and the godless. And therefore, very often within certain elements of the most passionate advocates for Israel is a perception of the state of Israel as the biblical ingathering of the people to facilitate the second coming and the final advent of the Christian Messiah, which will come about with this massive showdown between the forces in which Jews are essentially the agents of the Christian agenda against the forces which are often portrayed as the Muslim world. And very often, in terms of this cataclysmic, to use its correct theological description, this is called premillennial dispensationalism. That's its technical term. And it's, in a sense, a mirror image of Osama bin Laden's ideology, that the Jews are essentially the tool of the Western world to attack Islam, and everybody therefore sees the Jews as the focus of this clash. And in these ideologies, in these Manichaean, dualistic ideologies. Everybody wants to see the ultimate transformation of the Jews in some way or another, and generally is willing to fight the battle to the end, to the very last Jewish drop of blood. Thank you very much. So it's a real problem to be able to welcome support for Israel on the part of those who only see you as a tool for their own final aspirations, in which your outcome is hardly something that you want to celebrate or look forward to in terms of their criteria. However, it's not fair to identify even all of the more conservative evangelicals as all being to be identified with premillennial dispensationalism. And like in most cases, we should not make generalizations, and we should try to discover what are the genuine positions of anyone we interact with. I also don't think that Israel today can afford to be dismissive of support, especially when it faces certain serious threats. And therefore, I think that on principle, we should encourage support for Israel, but we should have honesty and integrity about our position. Two things. First of all, we should never do what I think certain Israeli politicians do, and that is go to certain congregations and speak to them as if we share their religious eschatological end-of-days agenda. That is not self-respecting, and that is not responsible, neither theologically nor morally, nor I think just in terms of our own dignity. The second thing which I believe should be the red line is that on principle, we should not encourage or cooperate with those who are opposed to peace. If their approach is that they support Israel because they want Israel to bring about this final showdown, and they are not willing for Israelis to be able to live in security and comfort as Israelis, as Jews, as well as the minorities that are within Israeli society, then I don't think it's appropriate to cooperate with such elements. So they might not have to agree with different political positions. They could have their own political opinions, but on principle, even if it's not possible, on principle, they should not be those who are opposed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict so that Israel and the Arabs may live, each one flourishing in their own land.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.